Iran has announced that it plans another breach of its commitments under an international deal agreed in 2015 restricting its nuclear capabilities. It's the fourth breach Iran has made since Donald Trump withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and instated the heaviest sanctions on the country it has ever seen. Well, joining me now from Los Angeles is Jamal Abdi, the president of the National Iranian-American Council. Jamal, thank you so much for talking to us this morning. What do you make of this? Why is Iran ramping up its nuclear capabilities?
Iran is interested in having the nuclear deal go according to plan. And Iran is not receiving sanctions relief because Donald Trump exited the deal. The Europeans have attempted to try to fill the void that has been left because of U.S. sanctions and have not been able to do so, because ultimately it's going to come down to the U.S. allowing Europe to move forward with the sanctions relief. So Iran, in response, it's ratcheting up its own pressure. Just as the United States is ratcheting up sanctions, Iran is ratcheting up its nuclear program. And really, we're on a trajectory where by the end of 2020, even potentially before the U.S. elections, the Iran nuclear deal may have fully collapsed, and Iran may be on the verge of having an undetectable nuclear breakout capability.
What do you make of the Iranian? Let's talk about the sanctions, right? The heaviest sanctions that have ever been put on the country, and Iran just says it's economic terrorism.
Well, you know, the sanctions are not targeted at government officials or really targeted at anybody. They are broad sanctions aimed at the entire Iranian economy. And recently, the Trump administration even leveled sanctions directly targeted at humanitarian trade, meaning food and medicine. So it depends on what your definition of terrorism is. But when you see a government actually trying to impose broad pressure on an entire population, that doesn't necessarily comport with the international norms and the protections against this sort of collective punishment that we have seen, in past generations, but which really violate U.S. law and potentially violate international law.
So what's the end game here? I mean, is this just a dead-end policy? Because at the end of the day, there is no way out for Iran other than complete and utter surrender.
It is a dead-end policy. And I think many in Washington realize that. And there are some within the Trump administration who, because of ego or ideology, have not reconciled that this maximum pressure approach is not yielding any benefits, and it is not bringing Iran to its knees as was promised. I think that the people behind this policy thought that this was going to cause so much suffering inside of Iran that the people were going to rise up and, if not topple the Iranian government, then put so much pressure that the Iranian government was going to come to the table to capitulate to the United States. That is clearly not the case. Iran has actually been meeting pressure with pressure. They have engaged in escalatory and at times reckless actions that have put the U.S. and Iran on the brink of war. And it's all because of this failed policy. So I think for Trump, he really needs a face-saving way out of this. And so far, the Iranians have been unwilling to grant him what no other president has had, which is a face-to-face meeting. In lieu of that, I don't see how we get out of this conflict. It really looks like we're headed towards either a confrontation or Iran with a full-blown nuclear program and the U.S. with few tools to actually deal with it. So somebody's going to have to blink. And I think that the expectation is that eventually it's going to have to be Washington, but Trump is not there yet.
Do you think the Iranians are just holding out hope that come 2020 there's going to be a new administration in the White House?
I don't necessarily think that's the case. I do think that the Iranians believe that Trump is actually going to win and have calculated that, if they give in to holding a meeting with Trump, the narrative is going to be that it was pressure that brought Iran to the table, and that by putting more pressure and violating the nuclear deal, they were able to extract concessions out of Iran. So Iran very much needs a face-saving way out of this as well. But I think that for Iran, they would probably be inclined to actually, strike a new deal with Trump. But the first thing that has to happen is, the sanctions relief that was initially promised. Some level of that from the United States would have to come through to give the Iranians the cover to be able to say, OK, now we can go ahead and meet with this guy. Because you have to keep in mind, inside of Iran, those that were behind this deal, who wanted negotiations with the West, who brokered this historic compromise, they took a lot of heat from the hardline and conservative factions inside of Iran. And when Trump pulled out of the deal, those factions said, see, we told you so, compromise is weak, and you need to resist the United States. So they have their own political challenges, and somebody needs to be able to give the space for the Iranians to come back. And some could say the same needs to happen. The Iranians need to find a way to give Trump the space for him to be able to do an about-face.
What about the Europeans in all of this? How do the Iranians feel about Europe and their inability to keep the US in the JCPOA?
So for Iran, I actually don't think that the Iranians necessarily want a relationship with the United States or even economic ties with the United States. This was actually after the nuclear deal was originally struck. This was the main criticism from Iran's supreme leader and critics of the deal, that they felt that by opening up Iran's economy to the United States, it would usher in U.S. influence and infiltration. But the Iranians do want a relationship with Europe. They do see the benefits of having economic ties with Europe. And I think that there has been a lot of frustration that even as Europe stays within the deal, they have not been able to convince European companies and banks to go along with trade with Iran, because those companies and banks are ultimately worried about the United States. And so I think the calculation inside of Iran is that even if they don't want relations with the United States, there is an acknowledgement that if they're going to have relationships with Europe, Europe does not have the power to actually forge those relationships, and the United States will have to be a part of this. So for that reason, I do think that the Iranians would accept some measure that left the U.S. out of the deal but enabled Europe to begin trading with Iran. And Macron put forward an offer that would do a version of this, a $15 billion loan. But it came down to they could not even effectuate that loan without the U.S. giving the blessing. So it all comes down to the United States.
Okay, Jamal, thanks a lot. Jamal's the president of the National Iranian American Council. Thanks, Jamal.
My pleasure.